Hola. Buenas tardes. Bueno, gracias por.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started with our first panel of the afternoon. We have the introduction video with you. Training human talent for innovation economies. Marc Sedam, VP, New York University, NYU Langone Health, US of A. Lorena Rojas Vega, consultant, WIPO, Switzerland, facilitator, Blanca Mejía, partner at Bufete, Mejía and Associates, Honduras. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by letting you know that this will be a multilingual panel, and so there will be interventions both in English and in Spanish, and we will have simultaneous interpretation to facilitate the participation of the whole audience. So anyone who needs interpretation, please raise your hands so that you can get your devices in the back of the room. I'd like to start by saying that it is an honor for me to facilitate this panel, Training Human Talent for Innovation Economies. This is a space designed to reflect on how we are preparing people, and especially the new generations, to face the challenges of a knowledge-based economy, technology, and creativity. We know for a fact that behind each innovation, there is human talent. So this panel will discuss how these educational systems are organized, how to strengthen institutional capacity, and how to create strategic alliances that allow to close the gap between what we teach and what is actually truly needed to innovate. I like to highlight that this discussion can result particularly valuable for those who lead spaces with young people and any initiative focused on the training of new generations of professionals, particularly in IP. Understand how human talent is formed under ever-changing environments, and that is a key to project ourselves as agents of innovation within our own ecosystems. We will now start by introducing my panel colleagues, who are two notable experts and who will provide their viewpoints from very different contexts but relevant for our regions. Starting with Lorena Rojas. She is currently an advisor for technology transfer for the IP department for the WIPO, located in Switzerland, Geneva, and her work focuses in the framework of institutional frameworks that provide an institutional transfer of technology to strengthen ecosystems for innovation and in public institutions. She has a solid trajectory in IP, from drafting their rights up until their transfer with a master's in innovation by the University of San Andres in Argentina and a doctor in biometric sciences by UNAM.
Of introducing our second panelist, Mr. Marc Sedam. Marc is the Vice President for Technology Opportunities and Ventures at New York University, NYU, where he leads the commercialization of intellectual property across all NYU campuses, including its top-ranked medical school. He previously served as Vice Provost for Innovation and New Ventures at the University of New Hampshire, where he held the position the university among the top 10 mid-sized U.S. institutions for innovation and impact. Round of applause, please.
Gracias nuevamente. Thank you once again to the people who are here with us to open this space in a constructive fashion. I'd like to first address the general framework of what training human talent means. This is not only a change in content and education, we're talking about redesigning the focus, methodologies, institutional coordination, and political challenges. So first I'd like to begin with a question for each of you so that we can set our starting point and a regional perspective as well as an institutional one. Starting with Lorena, why does human talent is considered a basic pillar for innovation economies?
The invitation to this panel. Oi, boa tarde, pessoal. Em nome da OMPI, agradeço o convite da ASIPI para este painel. Y bueno, como les había comentado, represento a la versión.
So I was mentioning, I represent intellectual property organization, Mr. Marco Aleman, director for the innovation ecosystems, has asked me to send his warmest regards, and I'd like to begin with the question that Blanca has just mentioned. Talk about new publications that are recently being published by WIPO, the landscape reports. These are analyses that are using the patent documents to answer very specific questions in technological sectors. One of these actually analyzed the trends of behavior in vaccines and treatments called, in Spanish, it has a huge name, Vaccines and Therapeutical Treatments Pertaining COVID-19, about the activity of patenting activities during the pandemic. So, besides showing what the technological trends for treatment were during pandemic, and diagnosis, showed us something very interesting. The fourth part of patent requests during this period of time resulted from large pharmaceutical companies, biotechnological startups, universities, and research institutes, showing that cooperation was actually cross-cutting amongst the different stakeholders in the innovation industry. And so in that sense, innovation is not something that happens automatically, so to speak. The commodity or the main issue here are cooperation between people, researchers who feed the work of attorneys, technology transfer that translate these ideas into valuable assets. And as we discussed in the previous panel, the government, directives, interested in promoting public policies. I'm very bothered by this phrase that says we are all needed, but nobody is irreplaceable. But when I was looking at Luis Graneti's panel from El Salvador, we realized that the push in innovation really does depend on the talent of people. With this, what I want to say, Blanca, is there's no transparency in technology if there's no transparency in the knowledge, and the knowledge is provided by people. Yes, I think we can really tell that a lot of these challenges are linked to human capacity building with a certain level of expertise that connect to the productive sector and help close this gap as much as possible. And this also helps us look at universities as strategic spaces to anticipate, to prepare the future generations and what's coming. Thank you, Lorena. And with that, we will now give the floor to Marc.
Universities do to engage more meaningfully in discussions on the workforce needed for the innovation economy?
Yeah, just trying multiple languages here, so thank you all for having me. I would have attempted to speak Spanish, but the only phrase I remember from high school was no tengo mi tarea. So that's not helping today. The role of universities in innovation is very complicated. You think about how policies work and how economies work. And underlying all of that is the people, right? But when you think about what a university does, we tend to teach what is known, right? So education looks backwards a little bit with the hope that you can look forward. So we have engineering textbooks that are still showing equations from the 1850s. We have literature that looks backwards and says, let's study these and say what they mean. And then you're challenged with thinking about how do you teach innovation, which by definition is looking at the unknown. We're trying to predict the unknowable in the future. So how does an educational institution stay true to who it is and provide a high-quality education, but provide a framework for students to think, I don't want to say outside the box, because there's no box, but to think beyond what's in the textbook. And so there are several programs that have come up in the US that I think have been translated. I know some programs are run in Central America that do this, but one of them is called lean startups. So you can sort of nod your head if you've heard of those things like that. I know it's mostly IP people, but in education, the lean startup is a fairly well-known concept. And what that does is teach the principles of what I like to call entrepreneurial thinking and doing. So it's not, I want to be clear, we're not teaching entrepreneurship, because I actually think entrepreneurship can't be taught. It has to be learned and experienced. But you teach people the principles for asking questions, for being inquisitive, for looking at what needs to be done, not what has to be done. And those principles of entrepreneurial thinking and doing are a framework of innovation, because you're not just saying, please recite this law statute, or please tell me this scientific formula. It's a series of questions and a method of inquiry that actually isn't unlike law school in some regards, of teaching how to ask questions methodically on different areas but agnostic of subject matter. And I think that's what's important, is a government can think about, well, I want to be, in fact, El Salvador said in one of its recent law in 2023 that it wanted to be the center of technology and AI. Right, but to do that, you have to teach the workforce underneath how to do AI and machine learning. But AI really didn't exist. I mean, it existed for 30 years, but it really wasn't AI until 2 years ago. So what you're asking students is, you enrolled when no one cared about AI the way they care about it now, and 4 years later, you have to come out and be able to deal with it. Right, so it can't be subject matter based, it has to be inquiry based. And that lean startup methodology, I think, is one of the ways to get after that.
Yeah, definitely. I think you really point us you opened the door for an interesting angle. And I guess that relates to the fact that universities not only serve as educators, but are also collaborators of the innovation economy. So in that regard, let me move over to Lorena. Desde tu experiencia con política.
From your experience with institutional policies, what role should the institutional frameworks play in developing human capital for knowledge economies? What do you think are necessary and urgent reforms in this subject matter? Thank you, Blanca. I think that all of you are a very specialized audience, but I wanted to point out, as Mr. Camilo pointed out in the morning panel, from WIPO, policies are essential for an effective coordination between the academia and considering academia as universities, higher education organizations, research institutions. And so this ecosystem that was mentioned out in the previous panel, where it doesn't really depend on the university, but if you want to move economies along from being importing economies to economies that generate products, which is what Latin America does. Universities have a great infrastructure, however, we are very far from knowing how to actually work together. And so why are policies so important? Undoubtedly, in law firms, when you begin working in one, you say, oh, or you get a client and says, oh, I want to register a patent. The big issue is that there weren't really a very clear rules on how to do this, and that causes legal uncertainty in the long term. And so what we're seeking with these WIPO policies is to create general awareness within institutions and favor this legal certainty that we strive for. So why WIPO has several programs to help setting IP regulation and templates, databases. But, in broad strokes, basically what I'd like to highlight based on your question is why are these so important beyond the legal certainty? And that is because it allows for institutions to adopt clear policies, clear rules on ownership, benefit distribution, and protection procedures, legal certainty to researchers and external allies, and to go from making intellectual property a legal tool into making it a strategic tool. Another key point of policies is to coordinate intellectual property with innovative policies and talent development policies. From the experience that I've had over this time working with the region, where a chip is being inserted in institutions, in the academia, and basically the theory is that universities need to coordinate with risk funds, governments, organizations, and so policies also allow us to generate non-financial incentives, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a while, and including IP management in the institutional strategies, because it's not enough to say when there's a collab, when a technology is developed, the ownership will belong to the institution. No, it also entails that the university is internally coordinated. It's not enough to have an IP department or a transfer technology office. If we're not training these people, if we don't give them an institutional framework so that the finances guy can say, oh, can you pay me the patent check or what the firm is charging, if we aren't able to get that signature, even when they're in Mexico, we managed to make some profit of this. Now we did not know how to bring them back to the research department because our policies were not clear on how to handle those extraordinary funds. Formal acknowledgement of managers and the technology transfer office. Another thing we're missing is that, once these laws on IP are very static. And just like Marc said, with the new technology, we really have to be on our toes. We have to continually update these laws. And I would say that having said that, we could definitely favor coordination of the academic sector to this virtuous circle, which would be innovation inspired. Yes.
Can I add something? Is it possible to bring up slide 3, whoever's got the audio, the slides? Trace, I remember that too. Sorry. So this is a little bit of what Lorena was talking about. So this is a slide from a friend of mine who used to work at the University of Glasgow. And what it shows is fundamentally the way that an innovation ecosystem works. It's a frustrating slide for me because I've used it for 10 years and I can't change it. I haven't figured out how to add anything or take anything off. It's really, really good. And what it shows is that, like Lorena was saying, the policies are really important, but intellectual property does not equal innovation. That there are lots of areas of a research enterprise, of a university that participate in the innovation economy, without having to file patents. I'm sorry for all of you in the audience that just got disappointed because it's no more filing patents. But there's lots of transfers of information in and out of a university. In fact, what I like to say is that universities' sole role is to create and disseminate knowledge. And how you disseminate that knowledge can be very different. It can be through startup companies, it can be through patents, it can be through licensing, it can be through graduation. You know, one of the most notable technology transfer moments in IP in the state of New Hampshire every year is when UNH Log has a graduating class, and all of those students go out, and you've now got 60, 80, 200 students going out into the world and sharing what they know. So having people who are flexible in it and are not just saying it's not just patents, it can be copyrights and trademarks and trade secrets, but also just simply going into the employers in relevant workforce, in relevant industries in your country, in your region, in your city, and being good workers, being well-trained workers, being people who bring that entrepreneurial thinking and doing into the workforce is another way that it gets done. So a lot of times, and I think the comment you made about the certainty of laws is really important, when you see countries particularly whose legal framework swings to the left and right, or it's applied inconsistently, like, I don't know, the United States right now. It gets really hard to incent investment. It gets really hard to build an innovation economy if the rules change all of the time. So one of the things that I would hope everybody here would think about is like looking at this totality of how innovation comes into and moves out of the academic environment, that you'll see that there's lots of different ways, and that policies have to address or at least acknowledge that there are all of these multiple ways to get things done. So it's beyond IP. IP is a great tool and it's a great asset, but innovation is a much more expansive concept. So thank you. You can pull that down if you want.
Yeah, absolutely, Marc, and thank you for your contribution to Lorena's exposition. I'd like to ask you, do you consider that there are any risks in asking the private sector what the workforce needs are to the university?
Yes. So you'd like to think, if you want to connect the innovation ecosystem, that everybody would know the inputs and the outputs. I just showed you a slide about the inputs and the outputs. And one of the main recipients of innovation, both from a talent base and a workforce, from tax base, from intellectual property, is going to be the companies that are there. So it makes some sense in some way that you would ask those companies, well, what should we do as an educational institution to make people ready to go to work, right? But again, think about how that works. We talked earlier about AI and machine learning, and that, you know, as a sophomore it wasn't relevant, and as a senior you better understand it or you're not competitive in the market. When you ask industry what it needs, it will tell you what it needs now. If you ask it what it might need in 5 years, it will say, I'm not sure, but I know what I need now, so teach what I need now. But what someone needs now, when you think about how curricula is developed, it doesn't happen in a day or a week or a month. Curricula is changed over years, epochs sometimes.
So how do you think the institution can manage those risks in order to stay relevant?
Yeah, I think the hard part is to remind everybody that the foundational knowledge that universities teach, wherever they are around the world, is still really important. It's the foundation for whatever comes to pass, so that you can't link it to any particular industry or any particular urgent need, because in 5 or 10 years, that won't be there anymore. And I think about the state of New Hampshire, where I worked before I was at NYU, and our economy changed, the underlying industry in our economy changed every 10 years for about a century. So it went from agriculture to shoes, to computers, to services, to now it's biomanufacturing. So at any given cycle, if you'd asked industry what to teach, the shoe manufacturers would say, teach people to make shoes. And by the time you had a bunch of trained shoemakers, they would have wanted to figure out how to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So it's a trade-off of making sure that there's not one end point. So we have 1,000 employees or 1,000 graduates who can only do one thing, but to make sure that they stay flexible in how they apply the knowledge without directing where the knowledge goes.
Absolutely, that's very valuable insight, especially when we're trying to balance the industry's expectations with the long-term educational goals. Thank you, Marc. Vamos a transicionar ahora a un
We will transition to a second thematic pillar, and understanding what is the role that universities and institutions play in this new ecosystem. I think is fundamental to ask what kind of witnesses and competencies we are promoting. It's not only about training technical people, but to potentiate critical capacities, creating and collaborative capacities that respond to an economy based on knowledge.
Are needed to develop a thriving innovation economy.
Yeah, I think I covered it a little bit in the previous questions. It's a lot about flexibility and problem solving, and less about what specific skill set that you learn. And I do think educational institutions are starting to try to teach that creative problem solving piece. So honestly, when I think about hiring somebody in my office, I don't really focus on what technical knowledge they have. I focus on how they think, how they approach a problem. So I'll often give them riddles or things that just see how they answer it.
So adaptability, would you consider that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that. And again, that becomes really hard because the students want to, what does every student want to come to school to do? I mean, they want to learn, but they need a job. And their parents definitely want them to get a job.
Yeah.
So finding that balance between I'm coming in to gain skills so that I can get a job in a field that I think that I want to be in, versus adaptability, flexibility, because again, if you just think of your own background, how many of you grew up when you were 8 years old saying, I want to be an IP lawyer? It's probably not very many, right? So you change your mind every 5 years or every 10 years. The average person changes their job 8 times in the United States. So if you're doing that, you can't possibly only have one path forward. So yeah, I think it's that flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah, absolutely. And because these skills are not unnecessarily technical, you know, they're deeply contextual, they're often human, which opens the question of how we translate those ideals into practice, especially in Latin America. Lorena,
what kind of skills do you consider essential to develop in the teams of intellectual property in universities and to be able to process successful technology transfer processes? Thank you, Blanca. I think I would like to give or bring you to a place of reflection, because you might be asking, why are you asking about technology transfer? We are a group of lawyers. Why are you talking about university if we mainly in Latin America we manage income from abroad? And I want to bring your attention to the fact that in Latin America, we are trying to change the mindset. Universities basically have funds for research in our countries. And so what we want as Latin Americans is to promote local industry. Local industry has scarcity in access to machinery. For example, maybe there is a microscope or an analysis that universities have because they got the funds to do it and create their research labs. But before, it was called linking of industry to universities. So what do we want? And for example, in Mexico, we tried to favor this link to create some sort of a win-win situation. But honestly, we still don't have all the skills in human resources and talent. And I think that
ambient, Mexico, SIP over here, and associations in general, they have all this expertise that we don't have in universities and academia. And I think it's the time to turn around and understand how universities work in administration terms, which is completely different from how companies work. And it's not only a dialogue with giant universities, UBA, Católica, Sao Paulo, or Autónoma de Mexico. There will be systems from private universities and what we know as province universities, state universities. So that's why I've been brought here, because the specialists in intellectual property, we have to leverage on universities. I come from a mission in Mexico where the current OMPI Director General has restarted a connection with the innovation ecosystem from Mexico and is closing deals with the network of technology transfer and the chambers of commerce with OMPI itself. And so we see a momentum in Mexico of trying to go back and communicate with the innovation system. And so speaking about this, I can say you will see collaboration areas of opportunity with academia. We need technical capacities that are specialized in this sense. People who work in these offices or in universities, they have to have a deep understanding of intellectual property systems, patents, brands, rights, author rights. They don't need to write very well a patent application. There will be more awareness about what is a patent application, and this will be convenient for you because you don't have to fight against a researcher who wants like an investigation article, and having skills to have technological surveillance, the patent landscape report. It's about starting to use the information in the patent basis to answer strategic questions, and that this helps universities and innovation poles of our countries so that we don't try to find the cure for the right leg of the cockroach. And we should answer questions needed by local ecosystems, skills that the universities don't have, strategy and innovation. It's aligning intellectual property strategies with institutional missions, manage technological portfolios, and prioritize on technology with potential in the market. Meaning, avoid to say, I want to start being a node of AI, but perhaps that university is a leader in maybe in Argentina, in livestock. Why do you want to move all your installed capacities where you have a market that is well identified, researchers and specialized resources? And this is what I'm going to discuss at the end, incentives, internal incentives. You will see how universities will try to incentivize researchers. And the third pillar, it's coordination capacities. It is true, as CP says, we have to teach the academia to create links, relationships beyond the university or with other universities, no matter if they are abroad, to promote open innovation and maximize capacities. And that's why these type of events, what they do is to favor these regional networks, and basically these technical capacities of management and coordination are the basic pillars for the training of staff. Thank you, Lorena, for the reflection shared by you at the beginning of your intervention. And yes, it could be confusing for us who are lawyers, because why are we talking about this? But you have made it very clear in the sense that it is important to recognize that there are different pieces in the innovation economy and how we play an important role in that system. And thank you for sharing what you answer specifically in terms of competencies that have to be cultivated, designed, and sometimes we learn them by imitating what happens in other contexts, and we will look at some examples that can inspire us.
Of countries or university systems that have done this well, what are the key points to those strategies?
Yeah, there are a few. On a federal level, on a country level, the countries that I think have done a really good job of converting from a agricultural or extractivist mineral-based economy to an innovation economy. The three that come to mind are, well, Korea, for one, that happened over 70 years, but that went from a country where there was not enough food for the population, and within 50 years they're driving technology throughout. But in terms of the things that Lorena was saying, I think of Ireland and Thailand as two countries that have done a particularly good job of integrating from the federal level all the way down through the institution on what the priorities are for a particular country. And it's fairly complicated. What you'll see more is governments saying, I want to do this, and none of that feeds into policy, and none of that feeds into the educational institution, which is why that consistency of governments is so important, because often the proclamations that you see on the news are not actually enabled by policy. And if they're not enabled by policy, then it's really hard to make things actually happen. In both Ireland and Thailand, they went from, through actually a very similar process of saying, well, we're not, wind each country back 30 years, that say, well, we don't have a lot of innovation, so how can we participate? And they didn't say, let's put $100 million into something. They said, well, maybe we can be the manufacturing area for something. So Ireland went all in on manufacturing drugs. Why did they do that? Jobs, in foreign investment, which was great. They then followed the foreign investment with their tax policy around foreign investment, which was why for 20 or 25 years, lots of people were putting capital-intensive industries in Ireland because it was cheap. And then from that, of course, you're hiring workforce to develop, to manufacture a drug. And then they learn all about drug discovery because they're manufacturing the drug. And then they backed into, okay, well, now that we have a reasonable workforce who knows how to manufacture these, maybe that's the talent base that we can go and start doing R&D. And then they increased an investment in R&D. And once they started increasing the investment in R&D, then they started changing the investments in research. So they started then amping up or increasing the investment in the university's research enterprises. Once the universities got really good at research, then they started to change to think about how do we do startups more, how do we do licensing more, how do we create more of the jobs. Because in all of this, when you think about a national strategy, it's obviously easy and probably straightforward to say, what do our big industry partners need? But when you think about job creation happens from startups. And in the United States, there's a famous study that was released about 10 years ago that said that over the last 40 years in America, new companies that had been founded in the last 10 years, had 100% of the job creation growth in the country. And existing companies were all of the job losses. And now that might not make sense to you because you're thinking, well, Pfizer is still around. But if you think about how many large businesses merge and then a bunch of people lose their jobs, when you think about companies that go out of business because the world changes, it's common for a company to last 20 or 30 or 40 years and then go out of business. The job creation has to come from new companies. So when you think about that continuum, in terms of where does everybody want to go. And I'm not saying this because I deal with intellectual property and startups, but really the economies in the world that are doing very well right now are the ones where the startup infrastructure is reasonably well developed, where there's a lot of talent to support that infrastructure, that they know how to manage and leverage intellectual property, that they know how to partner with other industries. And that's, I think, where this is all heading up. And then the last data point I'll share. So I used to be I don't know how many of you are familiar with Autumn, but I used to be the chair of Autumn in the bad year, in the COVID year. So nobody knew I was chair because everybody was remote. But the data from Autumn was that over 25 years of the survey, that first of all, the success rate of a university startup is 1 in 2. Now it's in the United States, but it's 1 in 2. So, whereas the success rate of a startup of any other kind is 1 in 20, right? So that's good. Then, of the 10,000 startups that were created over that time frame, 73% of those companies were still in existence in the town that they were incorporated. And that's really important from a government perspective, because the workforce stays. And why does the workforce stay, and why do those companies stay in the countries? Because they're next to the university. And why? Because that's where all the talent is. So if I spun a company out of a university, well, that lab still has more workers. So if I stay here, then I can grab all of those employees. And if I have 5 companies in that same industry, then they can start to share employees, and so on and so on. So it's really a powerful tool for a country to think about the startup infrastructure, not in the let's build software and build an app, but research-based startups, intellectual property-based startups, because they're sticky. They stick around, they make money, they can sell their assets, and when that company sells itself or does something else, those workers are there to go do another thing. They could go work at another startup, build a different kind of company, and learn those lessons. So it is really a continuum from just teaching to then having to teach these startup skills and have the ecosystem be able to support it in the way that Lorena was talking about, have the policies interact with each other, have the federal policies react, have the university policies support it, have the infrastructure of a location be able to build on all of those things. Because if you try to do each one of them by itself, each one of them will fail. If you do them together, you actually can build a more complete house.
Well, thank you for clarifying on what you meant by startup infrastructure. But is there anything you'd like to add on that, like just to understand the concept of what you mean by startup infrastructure?
So some of it, I was talking to Megan Carpenter about this at breakfast this morning, is like having good tax policy, having good bankruptcy laws. Like the secret to American innovation and entrepreneurship is our bankruptcy law. Because you can fail miserably, and 7 years later, it doesn't matter. It's wiped off, it's wiped clean. No one actually knows you go bankrupt in 7 years. That's our law. So if you have a really terrible failure, in 7 years, you're clean as a whistle. You can start over again, no harm, no foul. It's very uncommon in other countries to do that. But also it's about training entrepreneurs who know who can operate a small business. And so usually that's based on what is the industrial infrastructure of a country, and then you look for that, like that's where the startups come from. So if you're in an oil, petroleum-based economy, engineering startups make sense because all the talent is there. So the hardest part of that startup infrastructure for a government to think about is identifying the talent, identifying what laws need to be relaxed for small business to make them able to be more flexible than large business. So you don't penalize a company that's growing and has 3 people by treating them the same way you would treat the company that has 1,000 people, because the burden is very different. But I think it's that talent.
Ironically, that happens for them to be fair, but it's not usually like that because we're not all on the same playing field.
Right. I mean, the American Invents Act was meant to be fair to everybody, and it penalized all small businesses in exchange for only the wealthiest companies, and that's where we are now. So fairness is not Equity
all
and
that
equality are not the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, what is AUTM, for those who might not know?
Sorry, well, it used to be called the Association of University Technology Managers, but now we're just called AUTM. So it's the Global Organization for Technology Transfer. So there's 3,300 members across 68 countries. It's the only global organization for technology transfer. Most countries have their own, or regions have their own.
Interesting, thank you so much. So, traigamos de
Let's bring back the conversation to Latin America and the ecosystem that Lorena knows well. From your role in OMPI, you have identified practices or programs to strengthen capacities in Latin America that are helpful as a reference for other countries of the region. Thank you, Blanca. This is a question. Before I answer, I want to tell you why it's important to talk about how we help a university to create links. We had the public policies panel, but in that sense, OMPI support member states at a high level and practical level. Let's be honest, sometimes it is very difficult to push policymakers to have policies on a timely manner. These legislative processes take too long. My boss says, why Latin America wants to make laws out of everything? And I said, well, because you are the Roman system. It's very different. And it's not that I am against the rule of law, but sometimes it's not enough just to push public policies. It's also important to give the capacity to the operational part. And in that sense, I think that the example I would like to give is the one mentioned by Dr. Trigueros, the support centers for technology and innovation, the CATIS. And this CATI program was made a few years ago with the goal to support universities so that they can promote capacities in search of patents, management of patent information related to patents, basically to support industrial property offices so that they have more registries, healthy registries, because there were low quality registries before. However, these CATIs, they are not limited to provide these technical services. They are looking at many CATIs. There are about 1,500 CATIs around the world. They are not only in developing countries. China has 98. See, it's a country that despite all the wealth that they have, they keep taking advantage of these programs. Russia has 170. Latin America has some CATIs. One of the most important networks is the Central American and Dominican Republic network. It's a very hard-working network. I will tell you about it and the examples, the success examples, and another active networks that are very innovative: Chile, Colombia, and Argentina. Brazil doesn't have CATIs because they have innovation poles, and Mexico should join the network. This CATIS has been interesting because they offer a direct window to the resources of the organization in terms of intellectual property, to the trainings and the work network. And I want to say it's not that CATIS want to divorce lawyers. This is not what is happening. It's to give the capacity to have a better link, to have better registries, and in general, to benefit society. This is important. Technology transfer doesn't mean that you have commercial licensing only. There are different ways to get linked, and licensing is not what benefits universities the most. Sometimes your researcher they have access to materials, resources, trainings that they may have outside of the universities, and that the students are trained outside, but also that the industry takes advantage of this infrastructure from the industry. So in OPI, there's a manual of guides to establish an office for the technology transfer for Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's interesting because what it says is, well, I'll check your university, and see what's your level of registries in terms of intellectual property. What is your maturity in terms of the link? And maybe it's not convenient for you to invest in somebody who's going to be working there full time and get excited and open up an office. Just go to the different offices, outsource, but if you increase your requirements, your capacities, or the work from the office, then you can train internal human talent. So when you go to a university, you will see a gradient of maturity of these offices within the universities. And so when speaking about Latin America and these examples that you mentioned, they've been very participatory, and awareness on intellectual property is different from what it was before. The CAT network asked OMPI to help them create a regional model of intellectual property policy at an institutional level. Why is this important, and why did I say that it's not only public policy at a high level, but with this you give the university, well, while my government gets an innovation law or whatever, how can I make the university to be linked or give this legal certainty in the legal framework of the country where they are? So this happened in Central America. Other countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and universities have made progress on it. And I think that the biggest achievement for the region would be awareness of the link. Intellectual property is a tool, but it's not enough to put the title on the wall. But you have to go to the impact of technologies and the services that this will bring locally. How can we be more proactive in our collaborations?
This is really very interesting, and we're talking about pro bono, and I realize that this is a business, of course, but reaching out to help these university students from the very beginning can help promote the relationships, more safer client relationship. And I hate saying this as the WIPO, but as far as the quality of the registry, so what's going to happen if this is a virtual circle? So it's better to enter a patent because the link is a more skillful person, and let the firm do its job, and then there'll be a better collaboration in the future. And then people will start believing a little bit more in the intellectual property department. So as I mean, we might not benefit directly because it might not be a business, but we are strengthening the actual intellectual property system or universe, so to speak. Yep. So let's go on to the third axis.
Sorry.
Add on to that. No, it's fine. We agreed to have a hand signal. I was like, stop. I think something, I'm going to pull one thing specifically that Lorena said out that I think is important, but I'll describe it a little bit differently, is those links to industry, the value of those links is that the more connection you have with your industrial partners, and it's why sometimes the regional ones get to be a little challenging, because Ecuador wants to do Ecuadorian things and El Salvador wants to do Salvadorian things, and that's the right thing for each country. But the more links you have with those industries, what happens in the university is we become more aware of the problems that industry has. And that's actually the most important thing, is when we know through those linkages, what are the problems that industry in your region or country would need to solve. It actually helps us figure out, one, what to do research in, but also how to improve the intellectual property, because the more deeply you understand those problems, the better you can craft the intellectual property when you have the solution. Because I think a lot of the challenges of intellectual property from universities is that our research is generally so early that we have to file very broad patents, then we hope that some subset of those claims are real and defensible. But you can't possibly know, because it's going to be 5 or 10 years before that innovation becomes a product. But the more you understand the problem, the better you get in the tech transfer office of saying, oh, I understand that problem, and I understand what the IP needs to look like to provide a solution, so that when the research matures and you hit something really useful, your filings become more directed, more precise, and tend to stand up to scrutiny more. So those patents tend to last, as opposed to getting blown up in an IPR or something like that.
Thank you, Marc. So
we're going to move on now, finally, to this third axis, which would be the end of our panel. And we're going to talk a little bit about a collaboration, university, company, and the future of training. And so we want to focus exclusively on strategic alliances. And we know for a fact that the link between the academia and the productive sector can accelerate or hinder knowledge economies. And so this is why we see this collaboration to date. And how do you feel panelists should evolve, how should continue to discuss this? Starting with Lorena, in your experience in working with universities, public institutions in Latin America, what do you think are the main obstacles that these institutions face as they try or attempt to link themselves with the private sector effectively? Thank you. I'm going to try and answer this. From my background, I was the head of IP of the largest medical research facility. And, we had 200 doctors doing research, 100 other people, so it was so hard to get these links going. And the problems that I found there is what the problems that WIPO has identified are happening in every country, not only in Latin America, but Southeast Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. I mean, you name it. And so I have my notes here. Lack of institutional incentives or clear institutional incentives. Policies for intellectual property don't actually contemplate outlines for profit sharing. We do so, contract. Who's the owner? Who's responsible of this particular procedure? Who's in charge of disseminating the info? What happens if you don't do it? But we forget we forget about the human talent. How do you motivate people with these policies and don't instill the fear of God into them, And, what are the work of our relationship with the universities, our investigative systems, our laws for technology regionally, even though some have really made some serious progress, but just until recently, in 2015, I believe, Mexico punished for researcher to gain extra profit on their salaries. And so we had to reform the law so they can have extraordinary income. And so when Yeah, just record it. Yeah. Did you see the Mercedes this guy's driving, or did you see? Oh God, I'm afraid they're gonna see that I'm making some more money of it. I don't want to, say anything. I don't want to do anything. So in some countries, you're still waiting to generate these incentives so that researchers are not punished. Um, Policies for intellectual property that are not linked to innovation. Many universities, you receive it's perceived as an administrative end and not as a vehicle. So policies are not necessarily a paper that is going to be audited by the superintendents of the nation and see if no, what we're trying to do with the policy is that it works, as a strategic tool. Whatever we have in a long term, short term, a patent is not obtained in a year. So should I expect to have policies over 1-2 years when my patent is granted in 4 or 5 years? So we need to really look ahead. Be clear of local ecosystems, and so this is what we have been discussing. We're still a long way to go in trying to link the academia with the industry, and I think that is a problem of the academia. I'm sure you've heard, researchers say, I'm not going to do a technology transfer because that's prostituting science. And so there's still a generation thinking that basic research shouldn't have a commercial end or focused on commercial. And we have regional clusters, work tables. We bring in politicians. We bring in chambers of commerce. We bring in, people from abroad. But we don't bring in the universities, and they are the ones that are actually having the human talent that's doing everything, the local talents, and the infrastructure, the way we've described it. Operative limitations from OTTs, and that's, I think, where you can definitely help out. And there is still a need to generate skills for commodities. So figures for intellectual property are the main. So we're talking about contracts. You're lawyers. So contracts and agreements are complicated as far as licensing, for example, and that is still missing within universities and last but not least in institutional culture. From the professor that still needs to change that chip, and it's going to be very hard for you to interact with them up until the directives who's continue to have their goals on scientific productivity and not in connection with actual society, meaning just doing research for scientific purposes and that's it. Yeah, I think it's especially true when you're thinking you're kind of selling out academia or the research sector, because I've also heard the argument where you're incentivizing to innovate only in those areas where there can be economic results. Meaning, and it's a critique on the patents system, which I of course disagree. But it is curious to me that Latin America is pretty steadfast on this particular position, and also from what I've been able to observe is. I was a professor for a bit in a university in Honduras, and I really worked towards having the connection with the CAPI because I fully believe in the intellectual property sector. And I think you're right, though. This is not only about in Honduras. This seems to be the prevailing belief throughout Latin America. And I saw Marc. Oh, sorry.
You had something to. No problem. So I saw you nodding on that point when Lorena was speaking on it, and I was wondering if you had something to add.
Yeah, I think, like anything, the incentives matter. So the incentives in academia have absolutely nothing to do with commercialization, with intellectual property. It's publish or perish, right? That's what academia is built on. So then society asks the second oldest profession, education, to then turn on a dime and start to care about things that its entire history it hasn't had to care about. So I was sketching a couple of notes because, you know, one thing that is a really, I'm gonna make a suggestion as an easy fix that even in the States it doesn't really work this way, is adding commercialization into the promotion and tenure process, right? It's just like, how do you get promotion and tenure? You publish a bunch of papers, you have a bunch of students, you do research, you teach and get good ratings, and so then you get tenure. But if you participate in commercialization, if you participate in innovation, it doesn't count. In fact, it's a burden, it's extra work. So why would anybody do that? How many of you want to take on another 20 hours of work that's related to your job but that you don't get paid to do and be told that you should do it because it's the right thing to do? All of us would say no. So we're actually asking our researchers to participate in that process with zero incentives. And interestingly, mostly in academia, even the financial incentives aren't real incentives. I mean, everyone will take the money if they're given it, but nobody does commercialization because they want the money. Most people will do commercialization because they want to see their idea put to use. And I think that's one of the changes, I'm really, what Lorena is saying about the links, I think it's really resonating with me, is it's about not changing the way that universities do things, but it's making it a little more exposed to the rest of society and being slightly influenced by society so that you're not just being educated, but you have some experiential learning and you have some experiential education. And you know, a good example of this is, again, at UNH Law, where the online program, when you're talking about, again, Megan and I were talking about this morning, when you're talking about entertainment law, they take people to Hollywood to learn about it in Hollywood. When they're learning about high tech, you go to Silicon Valley. And what you're doing is not just saying, here's the book and here are the statutes and here's how you draft a good patent, but you're saying, how is that knowledge used in the world and how is it applied in the world? And it's never going to be applied exactly the way that it's in your textbook. It's going to be applied as a strategy. There are, you know, companies will file patents just to put them on the shelf so nobody else can do it. A university would never do that because that's a $30,000 expense with no benefit. So I think opening up the university systems to be, it's like a dry martini, like a little vermouth of the world out there, so that it can be influenced by it, but not forced to change. Because honestly, it's like one of the things I love about working in a university is that it is the second oldest profession. I mean, we've been educating people since forever, right? Nobody wants to stop educating people, but education changes over time. And so we can be influenced by the pressing needs of a government, by the pressing needs of society, without being asked to completely turn over the things that we do. And so it is that changing that culture of innovation, and sometimes university policies can be adjusted to change the culture of innovation. We can change our teaching methods to just expose people to the application of the knowledge. And like you, I taught at UNH, I taught at UNC Chapel Hill. They won't let me teach at NYU, I don't know. I'm out of the classroom. But when you expose the students to these other ways of thinking, they really love it because they're tired of sitting on the stage. They're tired of just being told and then regurgitate. They want to apply the work. And I think that's a place where exposure to IP early, not to file patents, but to understand what it is so that when you stumble upon it later in life, you say, oh, I know exactly, I remember that. How can I use it? Those are the things that I think, those are the fundamental changes that can be made. And some of the best universities in the world are trying to incorporate that in what they do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marc. So I'd like to go back to something that we were speaking on during the second section of the panel. And I know that you've led offices both in research institutions and have worked directly with the industry and with industry in general. And in your view, what do you think are the risks of asking industry to define university workforce priorities without sufficient academic input?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about that
Yeah.
before. And again, I just think it's about not one or the other, but a slight adjustment on each side to better align. So it's not yours is right and mine is wrong, or you have to change this. It's where is the bridge? It's another thing you mentioned earlier that resonated, is how do you create those bridges to something? And it's on a kind of a personal note, we didn't go through all of our bios, but or every job we've ever had, but I used to run a biotech company that was a spin out of UNC Chapel Hill. So I worked in the university in the tech transfer office. Then my baby project was ready to go, and then they spun out, and I went and joined that and eventually was the CEO of this biotech company. And I realized everything I was doing wrong in tech transfer, because now I had to live with the agreement that I had negotiated. So remember, I was in the university side, and I was like, here, company, here is my license. I renegotiated that license 4 times on the other side of the transaction, because the license I wrote in the university was only based on my university knowledge, and I was pretty experienced. I had done a couple hundred license agreements by the time I did that. Then I used it in the world and realized how it just didn't work. It didn't enable my company to be successful. So I went back and asked it to be redone. And then when I went back into technology transfer, it was sort of a fundamental reimagining of what tech transfer is. So the approach that we used at UNH and that I use at NYU is a lot of, we look at what industry needs, and then we try to change our processes to enable a smooth transfer of what we do into industry, as opposed to what a lot of universities do, especially in emerging economies and emerging IP infrastructures, is they're very risk averse, and they focus on what can't the other side do. I don't want you to do this. I don't want this risk. How do I put this IP in a vacuum so that no one can hurt me by exploiting the IP? And so you have an overly burdensome, overly cumbersome document that actually won't function in real life. And so when I came back, it was a little bit of saying, all right, well, now I know how a company uses a license. I knew how they use the patents, but how you use the license, how you use the contract, and can we adjust our ways of doing things so that that process is very streamlined? And so I think similarly on the educational side, it's just that knowledge of how to make the path easy, because regardless of your process, when you're on that university industry event horizon, things don't fail because there's one big thing that goes wrong. Things fail because there's 1,000 little things you trip over and you get exhausted and you just lay down to die because you're just fatigued by, oh God, I have to do this. Oh no, now there's another one. Oh, I got to do this again. So a lot of that is about smoothing the path so that if there does become a big thing that gets in your way, it's not the last thing, then you just don't want to try anymore. It's, okay, this is a big issue. It's specific to this situation. We can resolve it because it's really the only thing. Everything else was relatively smooth.
Thank you, Marc. Pasemos entonces ahora a hablar contigo un poquito, Lorena.
Lorena, so maybe on the issue of how can an innovation ecosystem, a mature ecosystem, ensure that the collaboration university private company doesn't just rely solely on these discourses or speeches or agreements, and rather have sustainable programs? Well, I think we should stop talking about innovation as a pretty speech and turn it into what the morning panels mentioned and consolidate it into a day-to-day process. Just something that comes natural. I'm in life sciences, and Switzerland is a hub of life innovation. It's been consistently considered as #1 in the Global Innovation Index, and I was in a conference and I thought, well, I was impacted because they continued. They say we must continue to be innovative. I mean, they're the hub. have German and French Switzerland, and for them their competition is who's the best, the French Switzerland or German Switzerland. And they're not only talking about technology. I remember that one of their Achilles' heels was the regulatory side of things. Pretty patent. Love your technology. Hey, university. Okay, so how do we make sure that this reaches the market legally? You know? And then you hit the US and regulation in other countries. And so that conversation is taking up so much time. And so they brought their head from in Switzerland to speak to the universities directly to see what were the bottlenecks in the conversation. And they brought in the person who was in charge of that PDA in Switzerland. And he said, well, this is how we're doing to try and unclog the technologies for T cells, which is immunotherapy. And I said, oh my goodness. And so they're already aware how administratively they have to make sure that innovation, how can they stay true to their innovation speech. So in that sense, I could highlight that there is I'm basically going to repeat what I found in the challenges, but I'm going to summarize it in 3 elements. Aligning with local needs this is what I mentioned earlier. So sometimes we must focus on the market that we have, a more solid market in our countries. Why should we speak about rare minerals if we're in the Dominican Republic? And our force is cocoa, and if we work in cocoa and that's our thing, then let's work on those things. So we shouldn't try to copy foreign models. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn from others, but we have to create our own solutions that make sense locally. And so Latin America is already at a level where we no longer have to see what MIT and Harvard are doing and copy that, but rather learn and create from our own experiences. Second is scalability of knowledge. Generate research. And this investigation, as I mentioned, should be able to be transferred, applied, and grown with legal certainty and through clear processes to transfer this technology. Thirdly, there should be an institutional backup, a strong one at that. So we're never going to be able to do anything or everything by ourselves, and we're not going to be able to do it if our immediate authorities, be it universities or governments, don't actually join in to this effort. And so when these 3 elements sort of come together, local alignment, knowledge scalability, and institutional backup, then innovation stops being a speech and turns into a sustainable process and a structured process. Thank you, Lorena.
Are there any examples of successful university industry collaborations that have transformed how talent is formed for the innovation economy that you are aware of?
Yeah, specific programs are a little hard because a lot of times the companies don't want to tell you what they're doing. But I think Georgia Tech in the U.S. does a very good job of engaging with industry because they've done it for a really long time. And so some of this work that everybody has to do, which is a little bit at odds with government proclamations and pretty speeches, is you actually have to do it for a really long time. And so something that starts in a year or 2 or 3 isn't a sustainable change until you've been doing it for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And by that time, your administration, your government has changed over 5 or 6 different times. So, I think of places that do really interesting work. They're very focused. So the other challenge I think that governments have is they try to do everything. And so you'll say, oh, well, maybe our core industry is cacao, but let's do AI. And if there's if you don't have cheap energy, you shouldn't do that. So you have to really focus on what are the key resources that the institution has. But I think that focus is really important. So a good example in the US is Embry-Riddle University, which is a very small university, heavy engineering, and they just focus on aeronautics. They do flight and they do space. And that's all they do. And every single person in that university has a job. No one wonders where they're going to work when they graduate because they are working so closely with industry that it's not workforce training. It's just the things they're teaching are being applied right away. And then the companies can look at them and say, oh, I love the way you solved that problem, so that's someone I want to hire afterwards. And so I think of it as, you know, the places where I see it being really successful is where the problem is very deep, but not very wide. And that's not to say there aren't other ways to do it, but the success comes from a really fundamental connection with, and I won't say a single partner, but with an industry, because you have multiple choices. And so, as I was listening to what Lorena was saying, one of the things I want you to think about in terms of economies and how you turn economies around or change your economy is, again, and I apologize, I'm in the US, so I will use US examples. But if you look at the regions of the United States and what they're known for, Silicon Valley, you know, computer chips, San Francisco for biotechnology, Boston for healthcare, New York City for finance. The reason those industries exist is because it was what the universities were great at before those industries existed. And if you look anywhere in the United States and you see like a focus in a particular area, Columbus, Ohio, or Akron, Ohio, for rubber. Why? Because Goodyear was there. You know, so Goodyear came out of the engineering program of that university. Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley because Stanford trained people on how to make the first semiconductors. San Francisco is the center of biotech because the Cohn-Boyer patent was UCSF. Boston is healthcare because there's a ton of academic hospitals. So that's actually the model. So in your country region, it's what's the university great at? Not good at, not does, but great at. That's where the industry relationships come from, and that's where the focus is. And then that can be built sustainably over time, because eventually industry will realize, oh, the IP is there, the talent is there, the knowledge is there, and I can continue to grow when I'm in that space. The last example I'll give really quickly is a place many of you have probably never heard of, which is Laramie, Wyoming. So very beautiful, but you've probably never visited, except it is the #1 place in the United States for optics. And the reason why is the University of Wyoming has an amazing program in optics, and they have, I think, 50 or 70 optics companies in, I won't say the middle of nowhere because it's really nice, but it's not a major metropolitan center. You can't get there direct. But that's where the talent is. So then the university did that. The state came in and said, let's support optics. Companies paid attention. Startups got created. And you created this little ecosystem around that. So that's that strategy works. It's worked for 1,000 years. Cambridge is Cambridge because of the University of Cambridge. So we don't necessarily have to change the model. How you apply it, I think, just depends on the culture in your region and the laws of the region.
So thank you, Marc. I was going to ask you what lessons we can draw from those examples, but I think you summarized that pretty well. But if you had to name just one skill that you believe will define the next generation of innovation professionals, what do you think that skill would be?
I'm actually going to go back to the very first thing that I said, which is that entrepreneurial thinking and doing. It's not being an entrepreneur, it's not starting a company, it's approaching every problem entrepreneurially, flexibly, creatively. I think those are the skills, the plasticity of the brain and the elasticity of the brain. Those are the skill sets that allow you to both be successful, but also change as the world changes, as the economy changes, as the government changes. I think that's it.
Thank you. I really wanted to come back on, I think, the most important aspects that either of you or both of you touched on, and I guess on your part, Marc, that was, I think, the takeaway from the general discussion. Y en el caso de Lorena,
And in the case of Lorena, I would like to highlight the incentives and about them. What do you think are the incentives to respond to the challenges of innovation economy that you would choose for Latin America? Thank you. Well, finally, as I said, it sounds distant, this topic. We are all part of the innovation ecosystem, but I think that you work because of the relationship that you have for lobbying to create awareness in those who can help us create public policies, and that you are connectors with the university to provide your services. I think you can inform about these needs, and I will do a commercial to a publication that came from the work session, the OMPI guide on incentives on the technology transfer. And so in this guide, what we did was a study where several universities were analyzed around the world to see how they incentivize academic staff to do something more than the monetary part. They don't have the budget to incentivize them. And so they found that there were different types of motivation: internal motivation with a sense of purpose and permanence, external with recognition, benefit, the professional projection, and the contextual that have to do with environmental, cultural environment. And when they analyzed the incentives, they realized that not all of them can be applied at the same time, so they couldn't choose just one. And they cannot be applied all at once, and they cannot be applied, they could not be financial. So for researchers, the incentives that could be non-financial is academic institutional recognition, flexible labor conditions to work. It's incredible how people are incentivized by saying, give me 2 days to work from home because I'm with my family. Support to startups, additional funds for research, a fund not for research for the researcher, but to sustain an instrument, rights to publish results. Sometimes the intellectual property system is quite rigid in terms of patterns, and they have to be flexible and understand that it's required to publish, and the patent is not necessarily a priority. And also we have incentives for technology transfer managers, and this would apply for their offices. It comes from there: recognition, peer recognition, and flexibility for remote or hybrid work. Participating in these type of places favor young talents, for them to have exposure to work networks and continuous education. And I think with this, there is no one single recipe, and remind you that innovation, it's not between institutions, but between persons. Thank you, Lorena, and both of you for your valuable interventions. Today, we have gone through a deep panorama that includes development of critical competencies and the collaboration between universities and companies as a drive for an economy based on knowledge.
And thoughtful contributions. You've both given us a lot to reflect on about how we build not just knowledge, but ecosystems that support sustainable innovation through education and collaboration. Este panel nos ha demostrado.
This panel has shown us that formation of human training for economy and innovation is not only a technical need, but it's a collective responsibility. And as we mentioned, the development of institutional frameworks, solid alliances, and a focus centered in human and technical capacities is indispensable. On behalf of the organization, we would like to thank the panelists and the public in general, everyone who make this space possible.
Y con eso podemos dar concluido este.
With that, we can conclude this panel, and we have 2 minutes for quick questions if you want to ask something. Congratulations, panelists, and you, Blanquita. It's a pleasure to have you here. To be brief, compensations, they have to be based on accreditation of rights and recognition of ownership. Institutions are geared towards recognizing the rights of participants, researchers, professors, even students. But at the time of monetizing these projects, it's when, if we accredit rights to the university reinvests in improvements, technology, buying of equipment, the maintenance, which is important, payment of researchers, etc. But when the compensation of the helpers come, that's where the discussion becomes complicated. There are experiences where students receive cash money and they buy a bicycle of $11,000 and they lose it in a drunk night. So one of the ways to compensate is to give them the payment of university debt, because it's quite a better spend money and directly hiring them, and they continue the research for their degree or postgraduate degree. What do you think? This is about incentives.
My rules in life is I never spend anyone else's money. So I hear you, but if I got a check for $11,000 and I wanted to buy a bike, I don't want anyone telling me that I can't. So I think it is, I think the incentive, the personal financial incentive is good for some people. It can get weird. But I actually think in the way that you described it of like paying the university back, it's the inventor would look at it as the university just took my money and repaid themselves. So, because it's like, well, okay, so I gave you $11,000, which you then returned to me, and now I don't have to pay as much for tuition, right? So it tends to be, I'm giving a very clearly American point of view, which is, once you give it to me, the money's mine. I'm gonna do with it what I wish. And across the world, that model of direct payment, when you can, when the law doesn't say you can't do it, is the one that does seem to work. I mean, we have a faculty member at NYU who invented Remicade, which is the 6th most prescribed drug in the history of mankind. And he's received something like $800 million of his revenues. Now what he did was he built a building on campus and he donated money back to the university. So I think when there's a little bit of money, people like it and put it in their pockets and buy a car. And when there's a lot of money, there's actually a lot, at least again in the States, where philanthropy to your educational institution is more significant than in other places. A lot of the most successful entrepreneurs or innovators wind up giving the institution back the money anyway, because that's not what motivated them in the first place.
Yo podría responder que generalmente
I could say that policies have a balanced view. In my experience, this extraordinary income is divided into percentages. A percentage is for the institution, a percentage is for the participants in the creation of the technology, and a percentage, ideally, it's given back not to the institution, but to the investigation, the research. The money that is given to the creators is theirs. In Mexico, I had a researcher who made his PhD, and then he continued to receive royalties, and he collected Ferraris. So we were like, how can he? I'm sorry, it was Mustangs. It was Mustangs, but I had a Nissan. but it has to be balanced, and except from taxes, the money. Thank you, Lorena. Congratulations for the panel. A question to improve this public-private partnership and ways to better fund these startups. What's your experience with matching funds to potentiate venture capital and fund this type of projects? In Chile, there are programs that are 3-to-1, one by Jorfo, and the other 2 or 3 are given by venture capitals that propose these funds. What is your experience and the impact of a policy of matching funds?
That into. I'm going to say that translational research funds are the most important funds that any university, region, government can do. And I'll define translational research funds as money that is meant to accelerate a technology from its first really important obligation to something close to the product. So at NYU, we have, and I'm going to predicate this by saying I'm very grateful for where I work, so I'm sorry about what I'm about to say. But we have about $6 million a year in translational research funds that we spend on therapeutics, on med devices. And we use that money not to fund faculty to do the research they're already doing, but to fund the next step that is beyond their skill set. So like for therapeutics, faculty are great at coming up with compounds that might cure cancer, but they're not good at testing it for toxicity and how you administer it and oral bioavailability, so we'll pay for those funds. So matching funds like that for governments or universities to say, if you get $1 to do this kind of work, we'll give you 2- or 3-fold, the return on investment of those is phenomenal. So the ROI on our matching funds is something like 7-to-1. Which is phenomenal. It's the best money we spend there is. Even funding my office isn't 7-to-1, but funding the translational, I'm glad no one's here from NYU because they just give all the budget to translational research funds. So those are really, really critical, and countries that put a lot of money in those spaces are actually really good. The matching on the venture capital funds is a really different thing because the success rate of a VC is 1 in 10. 1 in 10 has to be amazing in order to pay for the other 9. Governments are really bad at watching 9 failures and waiting for the 10th success. So they tend to lose patience. So governments as a passive investor, as an LP in a venture fund, that kind of works because they're just saying, sure, I hope it works out. But they tend to have really short-term memories. So $5 million in a venture fund, 2 years later, they're tapping their watch saying, where's the return? And it doesn't really work that way. So I think when you think about universities and governments, they are impatiently patient. And so the matching funds in the translational area are much easier to see and actually they scratch the itch that they're wanting to see. Investments in venture, the return is so stochastic and so far out that they tend to lose their patience, except for the largest governments and the largest universities like in the US, CalPERS, the University of California retirement system is the largest single investor in venture capital in the United States because they're sitting on $350 billion. So if they spend $2 billion in venture, it's not going to kill them if it all goes sideways. They can wait 10 years to have invested in OpenAI or in Gilead Sciences or things like that.
I think that something more grounded is to enable universities to accept this money because they don't understand very well what is risk capital, those who are going to sign these contracts and they are going to commit, and it's a very difficult concept to make them understand to these professors what is this. And the other thing that has happened, I think Chile is a pioneer in the region. They are doing really well. But what has happened is that the money comes, but administratively they don't know how to accept the money. It's stuck. And I've seen cases where there's money not of risk capital, but from industries. And there's a case of a university in Mexico, millions of pesos, and that they would not sign the agreement because the attorneys did not understand what it meant and the impact that it had. So I think the institutions need to understand what is risk capital.
Based on what Lorena said is, I've seen examples where the venture funds is just used to spend to do more research, and that the faculty will say, oh, but I did the research project, so I need more money, instead of focused on the product development and creating the product. And so Ireland is actually a good example of where I think they put too much money in the translation and the venture side, so that the goal is to get more money, not create a product or a good. So their goal is not to be sustainable. They view sustainability as, how can I get the next grant or the next federally funded venture capital investment? And they're utterly confused when it comes to like, okay, there's no more money. And then I've seen them, and I've worked in Ireland, they'll say, well, how am I supposed to run this business if the government doesn't give me money? So you can actually provide too much money, where the incentive is the money and not the product that reaches the market that makes society better. Because in the end, all of this stuff we're talking about is about getting innovations into the markets for societal use to improve society in one form or another, whether it's a cure for cancer, a faster computer chip, or a diagnosis for ADHD. If it never reaches society, it's a failure no matter how much money you put into it.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. Ahora el panel y lo
We must close the panel, and we leave you with the rest of the experience of today. Thank you very much again.
Gracias.
Gracias Lorena, Marc y Blanca. No tenemos...
Thank you. We don't have coffee break. We will go on, and then we finish earlier, and you have time to rest. So it's just a few minutes between this and the next one. Please give us the QR code for your donations for ASIPI social action.